It's Lucy Litch, and this is Tiny House Conversations. It's the Australian-based podcast where I interview experienced tiny houses, tiny builders, and adventurers in the tiny world so you can discover how to create, build, and transition into tiny life. Before we get into the show, I'd love to know, is there a particular topic you'd like to learn more about, or a guest in the tiny house world that you'd love me to get on the podcast? Maybe you know of a tiny houser with an interesting story, or a tiny builder who builds amazing tiny homes and offers a professional, ethical, and reliable service. Or maybe you know of other experts or adventurers in the tiny house space who have a message that needs to be heard. Whatever the case, I'd love to hear from you, and you can head over to tinyhouseconversations.com/request. If you enter your guest or topic request there, I'll do what I can to make it happen for you. Thanks so much. Now let's intro today's episode. Hi, it's Lucy, and welcome back to Tiny House Conversations. Joining me on the show today is Tom Coupe, who is a construction artist from Victoria. He has been working in the tiny house industry for 7 years, and for 4 years has been focusing on building bushfire resilient tinies. Tom has lived tiny, lived off-grid, and spent most of his life living in and around bushfire zones and fire-affected communities. He has recently displayed some of his work at both the Sydney and Melbourne Tiny Homes Expos. Actually saw his tiny house at the Sydney Expo recently, and can be found online under the name TC Tiny. And in this conversation, we talk about what materials, methods, and fireproof measures make a tiny house bushfire resilient, materials that Tom doesn't recommend to use in a tiny house for bushfire resistance. We also talked about fireproofing strategies outside the tiny home and on surrounding land, common misconceptions around bushfire resilience, the demographic of people who need to consider living in bushfire-resistant homes, and lots more. Tom is such a wealth of information on all things bushfire resistance and tiny homes. So let's go chat with Tom. Hi, Tom. Welcome to Tiny House Conversations, and thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Lucy. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So, Tom, you're a construction artist who focuses on building bushfire-resistant tiny houses. I'd love if you're able to start by taking us back to where your tiny house story began and what brought you to focusing on bushfire resilience for tiny homes.
It's a long story. I'll give you the short one. I first heard of them, tiny house, 7 years ago. It was at an Australia Day party. A friend of mine said she was building one. I loved the idea. I hadn't heard of it before, especially as at the time I was a playground artist. And when it comes to housing affordability, that as any kind of artist or designer, you basically put that in the basket of not happening. Houses just weren't something I was ever going to be able to afford. So the idea of a tiny house really took me. And I was also quite inspired by a number of people who were taking on these projects, which at the time was a bit of a novelty to me. A lot of people I knew didn't have any kind of trade skills, and the fact that these people, typically young women, were really keen to learn trade skills, I thought was fantastic. So, I started off helping DIY tiny house builders. I had a long career already in trade work and had quite a diverse set of skills, which lent itself quite well to tiny house building. So the first couple of jobs were DIYers, and I worked a couple of times, once a month or so. I was volunteering at an eco village down in Gippsland, and they had quite an extensive collection of tiny houses that were built also usually by DIYers. And I was just really excited about the off-grid living, the alternate and cheaper lifestyle that people were looking to live, and for people wanting to learn trade skills and be more independent. So I loved that section of it, and then eventually found myself living in Kinglake off-grid, and surrounded by tiny houses. Really, there's quite a lot of, this is down in Victoria, quite a lot of tiny houses and converted sheds in there as a result of 2009 bushfires. And I was working with council to get a tiny house, a regular house approved through the bushfire protection sort of channels, and just realised how much of council's effort was revolving around bushfire, and thought if tiny houses were ever going to be legalised or commonplace or accepted, they were also going to have to meet these kinds of compliance requirements. And yeah, sort of started from there. Also had a sustainability aspect to it. I didn't like the idea of building houses multiple times. It was clear that a lot of these tiny houses were going to burn down in bushfires. They're often placed in really dangerous fire locations. They're very small, often window heavy. Yeah, basically figured that something had to be done in this area, and thought I might be the first. I never thought I'd be the last. Still don't. I'm sure other builders are looking into it. It's been quite a long journey of development, which is now, I think I'm up to number 7, house number 7 or house number 8 now, bushfire tiny number 8, and overall about 12 tiny houses.
Oh, amazing. And I'm curious, are you able to share more about the methods and the materials and the fireproofing measures that you use in the tiny homes that you build for this resilience to bushfires?
Yeah, I share all my information for a few reasons. I mean, the idea of getting feedback from other people is always handy, because there's always something that I haven't thought of. So I always put my information out there. Initially, I started by copying the bushfire construction regulations in the Australian standards for house building. You couldn't copy them verbatim. I had weight limits, and those regulations were built for big houses, designed for big houses, and I had a small weight limited house, so I had to adapt them. But over time, a lot of my testing sort of resulted in a very unique set of fireproofing techniques, which is in large part in contrast to the rest of fireproofing and also the rest of the tiny house industry. Common convention is that the house catches fire on the outside and it burns through to the interior. And this is in fact not the case, or everything I've looked into suggests that houses actually catch fire on the inside long before the outside is really exposed to the kind of temperatures that would be required to set cladding on fire. So a lot of my efforts actually revolve around keeping the interior cool and stopping the fire from breaking inwards. So the first couple of fireproofing measures I have are on the inside of your house, and they relate to the type of furniture you're using and the placement of it, window placement and so on. So even the choice of wooden floorboards over carpet, things like a leather upholstery rather than fabric. These things actually make a genuine difference to the house's chance of surviving a fire, but they're definitely not talked about. You definitely won't find them in the regulations.
What about the cladding and things on the outside? Because I feel like I've seen you talk about it maybe in some articles or something on your website, and you say that the cladding is often something that people think about first, but actually it's maybe not as important as, like what you're talking about on the inside.
Yeah, so it's the first thing that people think of. It's the first thing that you see. It's actually the last component that matters. Cladding is a flat surface. It's highly weather resistant, and any flat surface that's weather resistant is going to deflect flame and embers and heat to a fair degree. What we want from an exterior cladding is actually something which is non-conductive, so that the wall stays cool. And many houses have been built to survive bushfire using tin cladding. The idea is that the tin doesn't burn, and of course it doesn't, but it does allow an enormous amount of heat to go straight through into the walls. And the walls have got, while they're not flammable, they are filled with services such as pipes, gas pipes, water pipes, your phone and electrical connections, and replacing those is an extremely expensive operation. So you really need your walls to stay below 100 degrees, and that means a non-conductive cladding. So I've actually done tests which demonstrate that cardboard is actually an effective cladding for bushfire. I'd struggle to sell the house. It would actually capitulate in the weather long before, even though it would survive a bushfire, it would be a melty puddle before the fire got there, just from the rain. But yeah, a lot of fireproofing is completely on its head. We often talk about, people steer away from timber. Timber is a fantastic fireproofing material. It is difficult to ignite, but that's not the point. The point is that it stays stable under heat. It doesn't expand or contract. It doesn't snap its fixings. It doesn't warp. It's non-conductive. These are all excellent properties for a fire-resistant cladding, and we've got so many examples of weatherboard houses surviving bushfire when the brick house next to it didn't. And there's two reasons for that. One is that weatherboard, timber cladding, is an excellent fire-resistant material. The other reason is that it didn't matter in the first place. The brick house still had windows, it still had vents, it still had doors and an attic and an underfloor area. All these things are huge weak points, and it's those weak points that the fire is going to look for to break inwards.
Right. And you mentioned before as well about the regulations and the building code. So with tiny houses on wheels being classed as caravans, do they come under that building code for fire resilience or not?
They don't. There's nothing governing the disaster resilience of a caravan. They're expected to withstand the average storm, but I mean, we can see what happens most typically in the US when something like a tornado would go through a trailer park. Typical caravans capitulate in the storm, and they're the only standards we have to go off. They're obviously insufficient for something which is designed to be full-time lived in, and for something which, in a country known for its natural disasters, it's not really a fit for purpose, especially for the bush. So those regulations aren't up to scratch for tiny houses, but also house regulations. I mean, then the bushfire regulations haven't proven to be overly effective. So even if they were required, it wouldn't really make a huge difference to the tiny house movement. I mean, they're not designed for small houses, and they haven't proven themselves to be effective against bushfire. So actually hoping that as they're written, they don't become mandated for tiny houses. But yeah, future will tell where that heads.
Yeah, and I would probably say that even with the regulations in general for living in tiny houses, especially long term and where you can put them and all of that, I think there's a lot of these regulations that need to catch up. I'm curious what the best material for insulation you would recommend, or what you use.
Yeah, insulation's an interesting question. I do take insulation very seriously. Typically it's just an earth wall bat, but often slightly tighter packed than you would expect in a regular wall. It's just spun glass. All insulation in Australia is going to have a reasonable defence against fire. Not that you can't set them on fire, but they're not going to spread through the walls. But that's not really the point. When we talk about insulation, most of your heat transfer, and goes for bushfire and for a cold night or a hot day, most of your heat transfer goes through windows. And that's true today, it'll be true tomorrow, it'll be true for a very long time. It's the windows that are the weak points. I'm often surprised to see that houses have thick walls and insulation in them, but the windows aren't even double glazed. Even when you double glaze a window, you may only have a 12, 16, maybe 20 millimeter air gap. That's only 12 millimeters of insulation. So even double glazing is still going to let through an enormous amount of heat, and that could be 10 or 20 times more than any wall is ever going to let through. I've done experiments that show that wall panels are almost impervious to heat transfer. On the flip side, basically any glass pane I put in will transfer heat eventually. I'm using triple glazing. If I could use quadruple and fit it on a tiny house chassis weight requirement, I probably would. Triple it is for now, and that's really your minimum for insulation. It all comes down to the glazing, and if you haven't got double or triple glazing, then really your chances of surviving a bushfire are almost nil. Your house is simply going to get too hot. So that's mostly where insulation is. It's glazing. Glazing is most of it.
Okay. And what about any materials? I think you mentioned some before, but are there any other materials that you wouldn't recommend using in a tiny house build for the purpose of being bushfire resistant?
Well, look, tin's the first one, if you can steer clear of that. Big question is, do you want to survive a bushfire or do you want to survive an inspection? And they're not the same. Regulations had to be written to appease public opinion. Consumer confidence is a huge factor, and consumers weren't expecting houses to be mandated to be built out of timber, to be bushfire resistant. So timber was largely left out of the regulations. However, I know that that's the best cladding for a house. So, I mean, as a result, there is a lot of claddings which do work, a lot of materials which work to an extent. One trap is aluminium. Aluminium's got a melting temperature of about 360 degrees. That's a long way below where we need it. We need it about 600. Rubber seals will melt at about 130 degrees. So your house might be sealed up really well in regular, daytime temperatures. Become a bushfire, those seals just vanish. So melting temperatures and anything conductive is something to avoid.
There's some terminology I'd love to clarify as well. So there's something called a BAL rating. For anyone that's not familiar what that is or what that stands for and what that means, are you able to talk more about that and the different levels of fire resistance? And then also, I'm assuming because tiny homes on wheels are classed as caravans, they're not technically subject to that, but I think you do try to build your homes around those ratings anyway. Is that right?
Yeah, it helps. I'm always aware that it's possible that regulations might change, and people who have purchased my products would expect it to pass those inspections, or at least come close. So I do try to a fair extent to appease those regulations, but also appease stopping the house from burning down in a fire, and that's quite difficult to do both. This is an interesting question. The BAL rating stands for bushfire attack level, and it's basically a rating for any modern house, legal dwelling, to assess how likely it is to experience bushfire, and also when it happens, what kind of bushfire conditions they can expect. It's mostly based around the amount of radiant heat that a house can expect from the flames. Also, its likelihood to experience ember attack. But it doesn't cover everything. You see, I've got a list of about 8 ways that a bushfire can destroy your home. The ratings only cover 3. So, I mean, things like wind or debris aren't really covered at all. But basically, they're looking at how dangerous the location is. The BAL rating is a way of assessing how dangerous that location is and what's required for a house to have a reasonable expectation of survival. The BAL ratings start at 19. 12.5, 19, 29, 40, and then flame zone at the top end. They're done in increments because we have to. We operate in increments. But bushfire is not an incremental disaster. It's very much a straight lineal disaster. Really, those ratings are intended to increase your house's chance of survival. They're not a guarantee. No one has ever claimed they are, and recent bushfires will demonstrate that they're not a guarantee. In fact, the chance of survival has only been increased by 10 or 20%. Basically, I mean, if you build a BAL 29 house in a flame zone location, it still has a higher chance of survival than if it had nothing. And alternatively, you could build a flame zone house in a BAL 29 zone. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. And that increases its chance of survival dramatically. The BAL ratings are purely the minimum that you have to do to build in that location. And you should not stop there. You should always go past that, is my belief, because especially with a tiny house, you don't know for certain how much vegetation can be altered or maintained to reduce that fire risk. So I always suggest going above that level and then recognizing that it is not a guarantee. It is purely an increase in the chance of surviving a fire.
And what are some fire-resistant strategies that people can use outside of the home, such as maybe on the land that they're parked on?
A lot of fireproofing comes down to the land and the surrounds. We're looking to reduce, obviously, anything that is combustible, so that's often garden beds around the outside. We're looking to reduce large amounts of grass and undergrowth in the area. So the larger the clearing, the better. And the clearing counts well and truly into the tree trunks. If you can see the tree trunks, we're in good nick. What happens when the undergrowth covers those tree trunks is that you've now got a continuous flame from forest floor up into the canopy. So we want to be able to see tree trunks for as far as possible, preferably hundreds of meters. But I would accept anything from about 10 to 50 meters of being able to see through the forest. And that goes a long way to reducing the amount of radiant heat you'll experience, or the likelihood of experiencing high radiant heat. A lot of planting there are a lot of fire-resistant plants going around, both fire resilient and also ones which are less likely to burn rapidly. You're looking at landscaping, which could be pebbles, driveways, stones, logs, things that are non-combustible or difficult to combust, which aren't going to produce a large amount of radiant heat. We can even go further and put up things like defensive walls, which protect radiant heat and embers and wind from striking the house directly. There is a lot. It's as broad. The landscaping around the house, the techniques used to do that, are almost as broad as the techniques used on the house, and equally as important. So it's one thing I don't have a huge amount of control over, especially being a portable object.
Yeah, for sure. And with that portability, I have heard some people say out there, just leave the wheels on so that you can tow the house away. But I think you talk about removing the wheels, especially because they're made of rubber and all of that. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Easiest point is that rubber combusts. We don't want it under the house. And it's not just rubber. We don't want anything combustible sitting under the house. And often with an underfloor area, you end up with timber stacks, or even things like fuel canisters, jerry cans, lawnmowers being stashed underneath, which are actually not just combustible, but explosive or flammable. So anything under the house which adds to the combustibility of it should be removed, particularly anything plastic, rubber, things which melt and ignite and burn for a long time. As for towing it away, it's a big topic. When you're building tiny houses, and we're going to an expo, and people have been arranged to tow them, so professional towers. They're brand new houses. They've gone from a flat workshop towed to a flat industrial area. And it's pretty easy. I mean, it only takes a couple of days of planning and $1,000 worth of towing, and about a day to set the house up and maybe a half a day to pack it down. As far as tiny house moves goes, it's relatively easy. It's not really an appropriate display of how tiny houses can be towed. It's the easiest time to do it. The houses are brand new. It's been done by people who know what they're doing and do it regularly. And tiny houses, particularly lived in tiny houses, get put in really obscure locations, often deep in the forest. They take a long time to get in. They take a long time to get out. Often they have tracks carved specifically for that house, which in 20 years' time may be properly overgrown. You've got tyres which will be flat, rotten. They rot when they hit the ground. They get destroyed by UV. So a trailer should have regular inspections if it's going to be utilised. You've got people living in it who may not own the house, so they may have no interest in saving the house. You're not going to get a tow truck to go into a forest once a fire has begun. You're not expecting to get a lot of assistance. Having those skills to move a heavy object is just not something that typically people living in tiny houses have. On top of that, we've seen a lot of roadblocks. And basically, if a person is outside a fire zone, the police just aren't going to let them back in. It's just, they've done their job. As far as they're concerned, you're safe and well, you're away from the fire danger, and this could be up to a week before a fire arrives. So they're not letting people back in, and I support that move. Basically, roads are kept for emergency services, stock evacuations, and people evacuations. We're seeing laws that would actually prevent people from towing things such as horse floats or trailers or caravans away from the fire anyway. The roads are very valuable during an emergency, any emergency, and particularly a bushfire. They're not a place for people to put their belongings or their houses and attempt to tow them along the roads in less favourable conditions, often very hot, smoky, panicked conditions. So it's a recipe for disaster. It doesn't really faze me if one person manages to do it. I'm talking about an industry which has hundreds of houses being produced per year, most of them going into fire zones. So really we need an industry policy which reflects a future plan for volume tiny houses, not a plan which reflects current conditions for a small amount of tiny houses. That's not going to be effective. So no, for several reasons, towing a house away from fire is not a good idea.
Yeah, and I would imagine as well, like in a situation like that, when it's an emergency, it's stressful and there's all sorts of variables that, are hard to predict. It's not going to be the most efficient and quick option and all of that.
One thing we have to consider is that the time frame for fire prep can be as short as a few minutes. It could be hours. The black summer fires, as terrible as they were expected to a fair degree. The bush had been dry for a couple of years, and the fires started quite a long time before they did a lot of their damage and reached highly populated areas. They were terrible fires, but they didn't catch a large number of people, or they certainly shouldn't have caught them off guard. If I think the fires I know best were the Kinglake and Marysville fires of Black Saturday. It was a wet year. It was not a dry period at all. It wasn't a bad fire season. It was a bad fire day. The bush was extremely lush, hence the huge fuel load. And those fires caught people unawares to the degree that the first thing they knew about the fire was the sound or the visual of the flames. So no tiny houses were getting towed away from those that day.
Yeah, I can imagine. And again, from a bushfire resilient standpoint, would you recommend electric rather than gas?
Yes. Yeah, definitely. Well, my least popular opinion about houses in the forest is that they shouldn't have wood heaters. Basically, anything combustible being used as a fuel source is not ideal. Sometimes there's no option. I concede that. But gas, obviously, usually we're off grid, so we've got an above ground gas bottle, which is its own fire hazard. On top of that, most of what I do is trying to stop the inside of the house catching fire. So having gas pipes or just any kind of gas heating, gas stoves, preferably you wouldn't have them. As long as I'm building a house which doesn't have to have gas, I won't. There are ways of putting it in and increasing the safety of it, but it is a hazard which best removed if possible. When it comes to wood heaters, chimneys are an enormous weak point. They're designed to transfer heat from inside to out, and they do it really effective the other way around as well. There are also huge weak points for embers, debris and wind striking the chimney and causing a hole through the top of the roof. They lead to things like kindling, bark, and small leaf litter and so on being mounted around back doors. Firewood stacks can be their own hazard. So best done without these combustible heat sources. What I find is the thermal dynamics required to make a house fire resistant mean that it's extremely comfortable during winter and very little heat, if any, is required. So there's no need for gas heating, there's no need for a wood heater. When you do fireproofing properly, your house becomes almost passively heated and almost carbon zero as a byproduct. So one of a number of really positive side effects of fireproofing is that low fuel requirement.
I have seen, I think it was your tiny house, you built like a fireproof little box or something for a gas bottle.
The house was the first fire resilient house, and while I'm still very proud of it, and I do think its chances of surviving a fire are very high, there are things that I've increased since then to make them more fire resilient, and removing the gas is one of them. So I've now got very large and somewhat expensive solar systems on tiny houses to accommodate that. But even so much as to say that the vertical walls are panelled in solar panels to increase that, to remove that reliance on gas and increase the electricity source.
Yeah, and you do the solar trailer as well, don't you? So what do you do with that to make it fire resilient?
The idea of a power supply being able to survive a disaster of any kind is something which I'm quite keen on developing, because we've seen so many people displaced, and just without the ability to even charge a mobile phone, to set up lights, things like cooking and first aid and so on become so much more difficult when you haven't even got electricity around. So basically, I built a solar trailer, and for the battery system and the inverters, which is both the expensive part and the most difficult part to replace, are in a firebox at the front, highly fire resistant, small box, which is intended to keep the whole system cool, and is very effective at doing that. It's very difficult to test genuine fire conditions to know if all those batteries and inverters would survive, but I've basically done everything that I can do at this point to make sure that they do. And one thing you're not going to be able to do is tow a trailer immediately after bushfire. You're going to lose things like electric brakes and so on. And anything that's been through a fire is going to need proper inspection by an engineer if it's at all usable. But almost certainly you'd still be able to get battery power, 12-volt electricity and 240-volt electricity from a properly fireproofed power supply. That could go a long way for a homestead. Also got the potential for those trailers are far more towable than a tiny house. Whether you could save that from a fire is more debatable than a tiny house. But also being able to transport sources of electricity into post-fire zones, fire-affected areas, so that they can be utilised as a community resource without the need for generators, which obviously noisy, fuel-dependent, and are always short-term fixes. So the solar trailer's got a much longer lifetime in terms of how you can use it and how renewable and sustainable it is.
Amazing. I'm also wondering, just as I'm listening to you speak, like if someone at home is listening and maybe they're already living in a tiny house and they haven't thought previously of bushfire resilience and building their home for that, can different fireproofing measures be added to an already existing tiny home?
Yes, they can be added to any home. However, you must be very realistic about what you can achieve in terms of the likelihood of that house surviving a fire. To build at the higher levels, everything is designed from the ground up for fire, to be non-conductive, to be strong, to be resilient to debris, to be resilient to wind and smoke. Just retrofitting on the outside or the inside's not going to achieve those higher levels. However, yes, you can increase the chance of a tiny house surviving, or any house surviving, quite simply. It's as long as you're realistic about what can be achieved, you can do that. Some simple things. If your house doesn't have shutters, then I'm not going to give it really any serious chance of surviving a fire, even a small fire, or even a storm could break windows, and then you're just exposed to the elements. So shutters on windows and doors are an absolute must, and they're relatively easy retrofitted. They're usually the last thing to be installed on a house build anyway. Things like vents, all air vents are a huge weak point. So I've just got a pretty simple system of a little fire door that goes over the top of any vent that you can close. So you can install a door that's a heat resilient door that goes over the top of a vent, so that in the case of an emergency, when you pack up and leave, you can lock it up, along with the shutters and the windows and doors, lock up a couple of vent doors as well. Those things are going to go a really long way, as well as ember-proofing the roof and so on. Tiny houses actually have a surprisingly large amount of advantages against regular houses. When it comes to fireproofing, they've already got no attic space, which is a huge weak point on a regular house. They're often filled with cobwebs, and they're quite flammable spaces. Tiny houses don't have them. They're also, being so small, you can actually go to a much higher level of detail for a reasonable cost. Whereas with a big house, you simply can't do that. If I went to the level of detail I've gone to on my tiny house roofs, it's just financially unfeasible to go to that level over an entire house roof that might be 20 times larger. So, anyone who's living in a tiny house has a few advantages that they might be able to implement against bushfire and increase their chances of survival.
So if someone's listening to this and they're thinking, I haven't really thought about bushfire resistance for a tiny home, whether or not they're wanting to build one, have one built for them, or they're already living in one. But what kinds of people need to live in bushfire resistant homes?
Yeah, it's a good question. One common defense I hear about particularly tiny houses, but any house, is they let it burn, collect the insurance and rebuild kind of attitude. My experience of fire affected communities is that rebuilding is an extremely difficult and a more expensive task than most people realize. Most people get caught short. So the people who need to make fire resilient houses the most are those who are least able to rebuild. And rebuilding can be difficult for a number of factors. It could be age or physical ability. It could be your mental ability to navigate a very bureaucratic system. And most obviously financially. we're seeing a lot of insurance companies not either people can't afford the insurance. The insurance companies are just saying no, flat out no to insuring those houses, or they may not pay out enough to rebuild. Rebuilding costs continuously go up. So the people, in the end, the people who need fire resilient houses the most are those who are least able to rebuild. And unfortunately, like a lot of things, this impacts women over the age of 50 more than it does the rest of society. They're often less able to rebuild or less able to build in the first place. And it's a very common demographic for full-time living tinies as well. So there's no surprise that the two cross over. That is definitely an area that I get a lot of interest in for custom-built fire resilient tiny houses.
I didn't even think of that, actually. That's a really good point. Because I was thinking, people that live in areas that are prone to bushfires and all of that. But yeah, that's a really good point. And are there any common misconceptions that you hear about fire resilience?
Yeah, a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, I've spoken already about tin being used on the outside of your house. I mean, the idea of towing a tiny house away from fire is a misconception that I just hear so often. You've probably noted that I've already got a lot of arguments ready to go on that on that topic. They're often just, the reality isn't really considered as to what a fire looks like, how quickly they can turn up, who they affect the most. The idea of defending your house too. CFA now recommends if you choose to do that, and it's a big if, and if you're able to, because they might not let you, then they're suggesting 4 able-bodied and experienced firefighters to do it. Now, I don't know about you, but I think I'd struggle to get 4 able-bodied, experienced friends to turn up in front of a fire. That's not really a reality for most people in tiny houses. Defending them's just not something that they really ever should attempt. They're probably the bigger ones. The idea of rebuilding too is almost a myth. It's not completely a myth, but for a lot of people now, especially if you're not a landowner, then the idea of just rebuilding is somewhat of a myth. I was living in Kinglake a decade after the fires, and they had a 50% rebuild, and out of those, approximately 50% were new residents. So that's somewhere very approximately 25% rebuild rate 10 years after the fire. So I'm going to put that in the myth basket.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's many more as well. And I'd love to read something that I saw on your website, and I thought it was, I don't know, just I guess going deeper into this fireproofing philosophy. So you wrote, "We need a new fireproofing philosophy here in Australia, one which bases itself on stability under heat, insulation, defense against flying debris, wind, and smoke. One which focuses on details like doors, pipes, and vents, as opposed to the outer cladding, which already offers a high level of defense against fire, regardless of the material. We need a code which rates timber, a material which remains stable under flame, has low heat conductivity, is impact resistant and strong even after it's burnt. We need a construction code which recognizes that bushfire does not ignite the exterior of a house and burn through the interior. Like a thief, fire looks for a weak spot and breaks inward, setting fire to the synthetic materials of the interior." Yeah, I thought that was just summed up so perfectly. Are you able to just go deeper into that and, the philosophy, I suppose, you're talking about?
What I have to mention first up is that those regs were very useful. They're not the effective regs that I would like us to have, but I had to start somewhere, and they were a great starting point. They also had many factors on creating those regulations, and there were people, highly experienced and qualified people, making them up. We now have enough data that we can expect and create new regulations that are more effective, not just for here in Australia, but we really could be the forerunners that can help the rest of the world with this, because wildfire is now an increasing danger for a lot of people across the world, not just Australia. Yeah, with that said, yeah, we do need regulations that, if you get your house hot enough, it'll set itself on fire. Things will start melting. You've got potential electrical faults. A temperature of about 75 degrees, 80 degrees is all we can really afford and still expect the house to survive. And that's not much. If you've got a really thermally effective house, it'll get to about 25 degrees on a hot day. And I know a lot of people listening are going to go, hey, my house gets a lot hotter than that on a hot day. Yeah, they do. If you haven't got shutters to protect yourself from the sun, and insulation to protect yourself from the rising temps, your house will get a lot hotter very quickly. But when you do those things properly, your house will stay cool on a hot day. And that gives us about 50 degrees approximately, where that house can rise to a temp of 75, 80 degrees. And we're not going to lose too many valuables, and the chance of it igniting on the inside is not too high. At about that temperature, we're going to start losing batteries, and we're talking expensive off-grid solar batteries. We could start losing computers and all kinds of electrical devices. If we get smoke on the inside, we're going to start losing all your fabrics, anything permeable, even your paintwork will need to be redone. And that's an expense and an inconvenience which people don't need after a fire has gone through. They've got enough things on their mind. I really rate the idea of being able to just move back into your house and still have your belongings. And a large part of our lives and identities are based on our belongings. As much as I don't want to admit it, that is the case. And losing those things can be a real hit to particularly even mental health post-disaster. So I want houses to survive to the extent that you can just move back into them and continue living. Not months or years later, but days later. And I think I put a lot more value on people's homes and their belongings, even more so than they do themselves. But yeah, having said that, if you get your house above about 80 degrees, the chance of it igniting on its own increases dramatically. When things start melting on the inside, they'll start putting off fumes. And your house could become not just combustible, but it could become flammable or even explosive. Things as simple as a fuel tin, that it might be not in a tiny house necessarily, but might be in a big house. You might have a garage attached. A fuel tin, you get that to about 40 or 50 degrees, it starts releasing fumes, and the fumes will turn your garage into an actual bomb. Removing those flammable objects from the inside and stopping the house from heating up, I think is really important.
Gosh, you've given us so much to consider around this. It's really great. And if someone's listening to this today and thinking, okay, I want to work with Tom, can you share with us what the process looks like to work with you if someone's wanting to have a bushfire resilient tiny house built for them? Is there any sort of customization that's possible, and even the costs involved or price ranges that you have on the different homes that you build?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've built things fire resistant for as low as about $50,000, but they're not going to be full homes. And for that, I mean, the fire resistant library, otherwise known as the book bunker, maybe something like an art studio might cost you around that much. But generally, at the higher end of fire resilience for a full house, you're looking at $120,000 to $150,000. And from that, you have to be realistic about what I can build. I mean, I don't build 1.5 stories. I keep the house low for defense against a lot of things. I don't build them over width for council reasons. But for that reason, they end up very small, on the small scale of modern tiny houses anyway. To me, they're fine, but they are usually 5 to 7 meters long, single stories. I am restricted. There are things which for a price you could overcome, but prices start going up steeply when people design their dream home and then say, make it fire resistant. It doesn't work like that. I simply can't do it. There are physical limits as well in terms of, for instance, a window shutter that someone can operate without mechanical assistance. The windows are going to have to be small. There are limitations such as if I've put the house as low to the ground as possible, it's going to have wheel arches protruding into the floor. And that dictates how the floor space is going to operate. It's basically all my fire resistant houses are galley style houses. I don't have the big open floor flatbed trailers that you do see going around very commonly these days. So I do have restrictions, and sometimes that makes the design process relatively simple. Basically, every component that I've now designed is fire resistant, which does remove a lot of the choice, which I think most people find actually a little bit relieving, because there's so many options on the market at the moment, and so many design choices to make, that I actually remove a lot of them. If you let me do that, then the price stays reasonable. The process for it, typically I'm going to have a lead time. At the moment, it's not too bad. It's about 6 months before I can start a project, and I work by myself, so that's great for the level of detail. It's bad for the time frame. And yeah, so generally they're taking me about 6 months to turn around a build, and the design process can go for an equally long period of time. I don't rush people. I'm not a huge turnover. I'm not doing bulk tiny houses, and they all are very much unique and tailored to not just the person, but also the location. So I would need to come to the site, check out, make sure I'm building the appropriate thing for the location. So yeah, the worst case scenario for me is to build something which is underdone, and having the owners expected to survive a fire when it doesn't have a realistic chance of doing that. So I do take a lot of pride and ownership over the work, not just a sort of off-the-shelf purchase.
Yeah, for sure. And what areas do you service? Where can they be delivered to?
I'm in Victoria, but half the tiny houses I've built have gone to New South Wales. So,
interesting.
Yeah. I mean, not surprising. I mean, there's been a few disasters up there, so that's probably not a huge surprise. And it is a very big state with a lot of people living in fire zones. Really, they can go anywhere. The only place I'm really going to struggle is Western Australia. You can't get it there. It's just going to put prices possibly out of reach for people. So yeah, that's basically, if you listen to this podcast, I could probably get one to you.
Awesome. And we were talking offline before we started recording the different purposes that some of your houses have been used for. And you talked about the book library before. What other types of purposes have your clients used their tiny homes for?
Yeah, I'm finding that work security from disasters. So disaster proofing your work is just as important as disaster proofing your home. And for some people, more important, because you can rebuild a home, but only if you've got a job. And if your job relies on something such as a valuable book collection, an artwork collection, music, for instance, then you might be more inclined to build a fire-resistant work unit as opposed to a home. And that's been true, yeah, most notably of the book bunker, which is housing a very valuable book collection, which the owner simply can't work without. And that would put a huge dent on her ability to rebuild post-fire. So, yeah, I mean, I've had interest from music artists, visual artists, at least two authors now as well. So a lot of people, particularly in the creative realms, which have things which can't be replaced.
Yeah, and I'd say there'd probably be lots more multi-purposes for them as, the tiny house movement grows, not just living in them, people that have clients, and I've seen like little yoga and meditation studios and that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's really awesome to see. And as we start to wrap up the conversation today, Tom, is there anything that you feel like we haven't covered when it comes to bushfire resilience for tiny homes?
Oh, a lot.
Yeah.
It's a huge topic.
Yeah. But I guess anything that would be like beneficial for people to hear.
Firstly, it's possible. We've got enough examples of surviving houses, so that we don't have to ask that question. It's absolutely possible to do this. And there are many ways to go about it. I've got a specific set of techniques that I use which work for my skills, which work for the houses that I want to build, which work for typically what I'm finding in terms of the location. It is possible. There are ways to do it. DIYers can do it as well. I've put enough information out. There are a number of people I know who are DIYing their house using those techniques. So please don't hear $150,000 for a fire-resistant tiny house and think you can't have it. it is absolutely possible to do it yourself. I think I've put out just about enough information to let almost anyone have a go at doing that. And yeah, I am expecting there to be more builders in the future taking on this challenge. So yeah, that's probably the takeaway message, is that it is possible, and that there are other ways to go about it. So.
Perfect. And are there any, exciting or interesting projects coming up for you this year, or anything else that you wanted to share that you're doing with TC Tiny?
It's been a really diverse couple of years, so I kind of never know exactly where it's going to take me. I do have a very nice project coming up, which isn't the most fire-resistant house I've ever built, but based at a BAL 40 level, so second top level. It is going to be a fantastic example of what is an affordable, accessible, and effective fire-resilient house. So I'm thoroughly looking forward to that. It's going to a location in the Grampians here in Victoria. And always looking for very interesting projects. Lately, it's been mostly almost entirely fire-resilient houses. There is part of me that just wants to the freedom of building the most decorative tiny house in existence. So, yeah, hopefully looking forward to that. And I've really enjoyed the expos that have happened here in a number of different states. Hopefully, if you're listening to this, you can look forward to seeing my work at one of those next year.
Yeah. So you're not going to the Brisbane one, are you?
Brisbane's a little far at the moment.
I know.
I don't have a house. It's sold after the Sydney Expo, so I don't have a house to show off.
Yeah, fair enough.
I would love to be there, hopefully next year. It is a very expensive and difficult thing for any builder to get a completed display model house to an expo.
Yeah, I'll bet. Yeah.
Yeah, a very, very difficult and expensive task. So basically, my year will revolve around making that happen.
Yeah, because I wondered with the Sydney Tiny Homes Expo that we were both at recently, because there was quite a few houses there, I wondered how they did the logistics of the towing and all of that, because there was like maybe one towing company there too, and how that all worked. But yeah, it sounds like it would be a lot to consider and go into.
That one towing company towed half those houses in and out.
Yeah, I heard that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, yeah, I don't know. Can we give him a plug or not?
Yeah, totally. Rick's Towing, right?
Rick's Towing is based here in Victoria. Yeah.
Yeah.
Give him a buzz. Knows what he's doing, and that is what it takes. It does take people that are experienced with tiny houses who know what you're talking about when you call them up, and know how to get in and out of where you want it. It is a difficult thing. I'm fortunate enough to be able to, if I can keep them on the small side, I can tow them myself. And that's really the only way that a small builder can get these houses to an expo like that. You've really got to be able to move them around yourself. So
if someone wants to work with you or connect with you online and see what you're up to, where's the best place to do that?
TC Tiny on Facebook. I'm also on TC Tiny Houses on Instagram, because someone in Queensland has the initials TC and a tinny and a spelling issue.
Oh, funny.
Yeah, so I've lost my handle on Instagram, but that's right. TC Tiny Houses, you'll find it.
Okay, awesome. And your website?
Website tctiny.com.au, and you can also find me on YouTube. I have to admit, I'm not a great YouTuber. Most of the videos on there are a little bit out of date, but most people still find them quite useful. There is on my website a number of articles that I've written over the years. Probably more my focus now is writing the information down rather than recording it.
Yeah, and I would say about your YouTube channel, because I watched some of your videos and it was really interesting to see you do different burn tests on there. So that might be something that people want to go check out anyway. So yeah.
Look, the overall spoiler alert, the overall result of those burn tests is that it didn't matter.
Yeah.
They were useful tests, but the end result was burning things from the outside, flame testing things wasn't the important factor. That basically everything was passing to the extent that I needed it to. So I sort of stopped doing it. And it became apparent that houses were simply not burning down from the outside. They were burning down on the inside. And picking up just about anything that you'd find in the interior of a house can be so combustible. It's a little bit scary sometimes. Not a lot of burn tests happening just at the moment. more looking towards the insulative factors and ways that I can make the fire resistance foolproof rather than relying on human interaction.
Yeah, well, I love what you're doing here, Tom. And, if anyone that wants to check you out, I'll put all the links and things that we discussed today in the conversation at tinyhouseconversations.com. And I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time today, Tom, and for sharing extensive knowledge around bushfire resilience for tiny homes and for sharing your stories and experiences. I really appreciate it.
Oh, not a problem. Thank you. Appreciate your time as well. It's been really easy. So looking forward to the whole series coming up.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're listening to this episode today, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us. If you want more Tiny House Conversations, stay tuned every Thursday because that's when new episodes are released. And I'll see you next time. Thanks again for listening. And if you enjoyed the conversation today, you found it valuable and you want to support the podcast, the best way you can do that is to share the love. That way I can keep bringing you more tiny house conversations to help you on your own tiny journey. So here are 3 ways that you can support the podcast. Number 1, if you have a friend or family member that you feel would benefit from hearing these conversations, feel free to share it with them, email them, text them, send them a telegram, do whatever you need to do to share it with them. Number 2, if you hit the subscribe button, you'll know exactly when the next episode is live. And number 3, if you head on over to Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to podcasts and leave a 5-star rating and review. Thank you so much in advance. I appreciate you, and I'll see you in the next episode.